Thank you very much. First of all, just a quick process question. The Secretary of State, the former Secretary of State for exiting the EU, I should say, said that he believes that if Parliament votes on the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration and it goes through, that it will be possible to start negotiations with the EU on turning the political declaration into a legally binding treaty prior to the 29th of March of next year, i.e. from the moment that Parliament votes it through, you can then start the negotiations. But we've also heard evidence suggesting that you can't really begin to turn the political declaration into a legal treaty until such time as the UK is a third country. So formally speaking, the European Commission wouldn't set up its team for those negotiations because the team that it sets up is would be based on Article 218, and you can't have that whilst Article 50 is still in effect. I'd welcome the panel's comments on that, perhaps starting with Professor Dugan and then others.
The latter interpretation is correct.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
From some of the discussions that I've had in Brussels, formal negotiations are one thing, but how much work can you do to sort of start doing the substantive preparations for the mandate? I think it also comes back to the question of how detailed do you actually want to make the political declaration in a sense, because we would prefer from a business perspective to see as much detail as quickly as possible, but is there a potential that trying to effectively negotiate as much detail as possible through the political declaration actually holds up the withdrawal agreement itself, which in turn holds up the actual move on to the substantive negotiations for the future? So I think there is that legal dimension, but in terms of the substantive question about how much do you want to put into the declaration now versus wait for the formal negotiations to start, that's a political question, in my opinion.
Draw the same distinction that Ali Renison just made, but also to say that I think this takes us back to something that Professor Dugan was discussing, the limitations of Article 50 as a highly deficient, which Britain and the Commission are both now amply demonstrating. It's a very suboptimal clause in a treaty which we're now limited in our ability to use. But I think it obviously makes sense for those. If it's not legally possible, that's one thing. But it obviously makes sense for as soon as the conclusion is reached on the withdrawal agreement for formal discussions to begin. Whether that's a mechanism can be found to do that, I think would obviously be welcome.
But we note Professor Dugan's view that in practice that won't be possible because the Commission won't set up a team to make that happen until such time as the European Parliament has given its assent.
We have to distinguish between formal negotiation, which will require negotiating mandates from the Council, and those cannot be delivered until after withdrawal, and more informal negotiation. I think it also depends, of course, on what the nature of the future relationship is likely to be. If we're talking about something relatively off the shelf, if we end up with a free trade area, a free trade agreement, effectively like Canada, or if we end up with an EEA-style agreement like Norway, there, we're dealing with known quantities, and we can more or less refer to them in not that much detail on the text, because all the detail is known behind the text. We all know what they look like. If we are talking about something more bespoke, then there has to be more detail, because then everyone is going to want to know what's bespoke about it. What are the safeguards, the limits, what are the institutions and the processes? So in a way, the less ambitious the agreement in terms of being bespoke, the easier it will be to have a reliable political declaration. The more ambitious and the more bespoke and special, the much more difficult it's going to be to have a detailed.
Thank you, that's very clear. The point that you made there in your initial comments, Professor Dugan, about trust and the key role that institutions play in building trust. Isn't it the case then that an institution such as the EFTA Court, for example, provides that level of institutional stability and therefore trust, which would actually deliver much of what is being asked for in the Chequers Declaration? So it would be interesting to know why is it that we don't just sign up to the EFTA Court and dock to the EFTA Court?
Yeah, this is true, by the way, not only on the judicial side but also on the administrative side. To come back to an example that Ali used earlier, state aid. Now, the Chequers Agreement refers to a common rulebook on state aid. The defining characteristic of EU state aid rules is not the rules themselves, it's the Commission being the virtual sole enforcer of the state aid rules. who is going to do the job of the Commission for the UK? It's very doubtful that the EU would accept that a UK public body polices UK public aid, because it doesn't accept that for itself, it doesn't accept that for the EEA, it relies on the EFTA surveillance authority. So I think that the problems are parallel in both administrative and judicial senses.
Yeah, so I think the key point there is that this isn't about words on a piece of paper, it's about the institutions, and institutions which of course have taken decades to build. Perhaps Mr. Newman, you could comment on that. I mean, how realistic is it that we get to December 2020, the end of the transition period, and we've built a set of bespoke institutions that have the buy-in and trust that has taken decades to build across...
Sure, I'm personally open to docking into the EFTA Court. That was something that we recommended in our paper. But equally, as Professor Dugan was saying, there are already a series of examples of arbitration mechanisms that the EU already has in place. CETA has one, for example. So I don't think actually that is that complicated. I also think the whole question around trust, I understand at one level the European Commission's concern, but equally Britain is a very rules-based country with very powerful and independent institutions, and I don't think it's really that plausible to think that Britain is suddenly going to go totally rogue and start ignoring commitments that we've made in international or indeed in domestic law. I just think that's just not a picture that I would recognise for this country at all, and particularly after decades and decades of membership where we've followed all the rules, sometimes argued around the table for particular opt-outs and so on, but equally we've been very careful members. I think the Commission should take a slightly more benevolent view about our ability to be a trusted partner in the future.
Can I just come in on that, though? I think you're talking about trust at too high a level. This isn't about whether you're a trustworthy country and a civilised place that plays by the rules. This is about the daily nuts and bolts of the way jobs get done.
Sure.
And one of the things that you see in EU law, and this is the sort of bread and butter of my daily work, it's the little failures of trust between authorities. It's when your insurance certificate isn't properly recognised by a French authority. It's when your forklift truck is criticised by a minister in Finland. It's the tiny hundreds of little failures of trust that risk the system.
So I accept that, but I think that there is and that is obviously has to be resolved with clear binding rules and so on. Absolutely. But I think there's also a rhetoric that we see from the Commission, particularly on unattributed sources, which does actually speak to my wider point about the UK suddenly becoming an untrustworthy country. I just don't recognise that.
There is a domestic implementation model under, I think, the Ukraine Association Agreement for state aid, but the difference there is that I don't think necessarily, and I defer to the Professor on this, I don't think because Ukraine is starting from here and the UK is here and talking about an actual common rulebook, I don't think Ukraine has signed up fully to the complete package of state aid rules in the way that the UK is necessarily proposing. So the more you talk about a common rulebook, the more you potentially do need a surveillance authority.
Just one very brief question. I mean, we haven't really touched on the agencies. I think there are 49 or 50 EU agencies. Can you say very briefly a couple of words about how you see the Chequers statement relating to the issue of the agencies? Because we know that in, I think, about half of the cases, the agencies have no provision for participation of third countries in any way, shape or form. And then there are a number where you have to be EEA in order to get observer status at least. Broadly speaking, what's your... I mean, I think this plays absolutely into the issue of institutions and trust. The role of the agencies in the context of the Chequers agreement, I'd be grateful for your take on that. Starting with Mr. Newman.
I think there are obviously some pretty fundamental concerns in that direction. Equally, there are examples of non-EEA states participating in certain agencies like Switzerland and the Aviation Safety Agency. But I think Professor Dugan can speak to more of the technicalities on that. I think another huge area we haven't discussed, we spent the entire morning discussing the economic relationship. I think more profoundly concerning in many respects is the security relationship. And that's obviously a detail in the Chequers statement. But talking to any officials inside government who are working on security, they're profoundly concerned by the attitude that the Commission and also member states are taking. The UK is not asking to sit at the table and make decisions on internal security and so on, but we are asking to make sure that operational capabilities don't fall off. And I think that is profoundly at risk, and it's something that I hope the Commission takes very, very seriously.
just very quickly,
Yeah.
in answering the final question. Yeah.
Agencies are a bit like equivalency regimes in the field of financial services. There's no single model. They vary about whether it's available and the nature of participation in a relatively ad hoc way. I think this is one of the areas where until we know better what the common rulebook scope is meant to be, is it literal border checks or is it a common market for goods, we can't really know which agencies will be relevant and therefore where the legislation might fulfil the UK's aspirations or where we might need to say to the EU, can you change your legislation? And I think, just to come back on Henry's point, it's easy, I think, to sort of say politically this seems crazy, politically this seems unacceptable. If the legislation says you cannot participate, then you either have to live with that legislation or you have to change it.
Change the statute.
And now we're asking the EU to change its rules to accommodate us. But I think the politics and the law have to work constructively together there rather than seeing one or the other as an absolute obstacle.
Okay.
Thank you.